There is an assumption that governments are financially constrained rather than resource constrained, and this stymies the climate response. In a global study of 130,000 individuals, the researchers found that 69% of the global population expressed a willingness to contribute 1% of their personal income to fight the climate crisis. Now, this indicates that individuals want their governments to increase funding for the climate crisis. One would only imagine that the pressure on governments would be significantly higher if individuals and nations with significant monetary sovereignty realised their tax was unnecessary to fund their government's response to the climate crisis, and that their elected leaders faced no real financial constraints. By explaining that governments have much more fiscal space than most people assume, modern monetary theory, MMT, supports much more drastic climate action. Now, applying the MMT lens could empower the climate movement to exert more pressure on all governments to act. To bring to life the disconnect between the climate movement and modern monetary theory, I reviewed a broad sweep of climate literature. In this video, I present the findings from that review. The literature review focuses on various public-facing climate literature published since the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, the pandemic was a watershed moment, as the response clearly demonstrated that when a crisis is deemed urgent enough, governments can mobilise the necessary financial resources for public purposes. According to the International Monetary Fund, governments around the world announced around $16 trillion in fiscal actions in response to the pandemic, as clear evidence as you could find that governments can always find the money. In direct contrast, countries at COP29 agreed a new collective quantified goal on climate finance. The new goal calls on developed countries to lend $300 billion per year for developing countries. Now, this is less than 2% of the financial wealth governments created in response to the COVID pandemic. Now, my aim in completing this review is to connect natural allies and continue to open space for discussion among MMT academics and activists, as well as the climate movement. We need to adopt a cross-disciplinary approach to climate solutions. Now, it's very important to stress that the findings are in no way a criticism of the climate movement. It's no different from any other discipline, and it's heavily influenced by mainstream economics and economists. It's in that direction my criticism is directed. The evidence that governments have more fiscal space is as clear as the science informing us of the need to respond to the climate crisis. Now, all the literature that I reviewed was published after the COVID-19 pandemic began in early 2020. The literature review focuses on articles that addressed macroeconomic issues related to climate change. The literature review is divided into 3 equal parts. There were 20 scientific papers, which were collected via a word search in the Google Scholar database. I looked at 6 popular articles or reports and 7 books, and 7 online videos or podcast appearances from well-known commentators, authors, personalities and organisations within the climate movement. There were 20 presentations from the 2023 EU Beyond Growth Conference that brought together various well-known figures within the climate movement. Now, this is not a scientific analysis of the climate literature. However, the broad sweep and focus on post-COVID articles help us analyse the mainstream climate movement view and can serve as a guide to prevailing winds in the climate movement regarding fiscal space for monetary sovereign governments. So, to summarise the thrust of my literature review, I asked, does the climate movement believe that governments need to find the money to tackle our ecological problems? Now, before concentrating on that key question, it was important to get an overview of the climate movement's view of our economic system. Now, much of the literature presents an orthodox understanding of the economy, and this is no surprise. The mainstream economic narrative has permeated every sector of our economy and society. Now, the conventional wisdom as constructed by neoclassical or neoliberal economics suggests that governments should run a balanced budget in the short to medium term, borrow from the markets if spending commitments exceed tax revenue, and curtail high debt repayments to avoid insolvency. In essence, the mainstream treats a currency issuing government much like a household, thereby significantly restricting the government's capacity to spend. Now, MMT rejects this view. So within the literature review, authors Lonergan and Soares provide an excellent example of a core tenet of mainstream economics: the primacy of the market. Concerning the climate crisis, they state, investment spending by the private sector is at the heart of the solution. And they also add that the private sector is the best place for these new industries and investments. Now, this is an economic opinion, not an economic fact, and both statements would be strongly contested by most heterodox economists. Across the literature, there is general support for the state's role to de-risk private investment. in essence making it easier and less risky for private finance to realise a profit from the climate crisis. The British Ecological Society, in discussing nature-based solutions, sums up this view. Public funding will need to de-risk private investment until markets for the full range of environmental services are established and nature-based solutions become a familiar asset class for private investment and finance. This is the financialisation of nature. Within the sources, the costs of the climate crisis are discussed almost exclusively in financial terms rather than resource terms. Although this could be an attempt by the climate movement to speak the language of finance, it alludes to the misconception that sovereign monetary governments are fiscally rather than resource constrained. This core belief at the heart of the mainstream economic orthodoxy has caused so much damage to our chances to properly resource our adaptation and mitigation measures. A powerful narrative within the mainstream emphasises the importance of taxation in providing the fuel to achieve policy goals. This is evidenced within the climate literature. The sources I reviewed commonly emphasise the essential role of carbon taxes and pricing to incentivise economic agents to change their behaviour and drive decarbonisation. Now, this is despite extensive research showing that carbon markets have had a minimal impact on overall emission reductions. Click on the link above or in the show notes to see a short critical analysis of carbon markets. There is a lack of awareness and seemingly interest in why funding was available for COVID-19 but not for the climate crisis. The Build Back Better bill, the 2021 US post-COVID-19 funding bill, which was supposed to release trillions of dollars, was lauded by climate scientist Professor Michael E. Mann, without inquiring why this funding was only available now. Post-COVID, the UK-based think tank Chatham House asks, what then can we learn from previous crises about what a truly urgent response to climate change should look like? It notes that the public information on the impact of the climate crisis highlights the significant difference from other crises, such as COVID-19, the two world wars and the Great Depression. It doesn't mention using the power of the public purse as the primary financial response to solve all those crises. On hearing that the Biden administration was planning to spend trillions on infrastructure across the USA, climate scientist Bill McKibben asked the most pertinent question: why weren't we doing this all along? Disappointingly, in his article in the New Yorker, he never returns to that question or, in fact, seeks an answer. Instead, he discusses whether this amount is enough to make any significant difference to the US climate response, which of course it is not. Now, within the literature, there is some heterodox economic understanding of our economy. Many prominent figures in the climate movement are sceptical that the current economic framework can effectively address the climate crisis. Authors and academics broadly within the degrowth movement, such as Hickel, Buller, Callis and Parkey, often discuss the economics of the climate crisis within a heterodox paradigm. Hickel 2021 provides an excellent critique of the orthodox economics that underpins the capitalist economy, and Sultana in 2023 expands on capitalism's continued colonial nature. The climate movement has a robust Marxist perspective epitomised by Tad Daly and his belief that capitalism accumulates by exploiting workers to transform nature, and also Japanese Marxist philosopher Kyoto Sato, who states that we need a revolutionary transformation of labour and production to solve the climate crisis. Throughout the literature, we found support for the insight from MMT Lens provides. However, their views were almost exclusively found within that much narrower post-growth or degrowth movement. An example of the support from post-growth academics comes from Jackson in 2021. He states that one of the widely held beliefs that a monetary sovereign state was like a household was profoundly wrong, and that the sovereign power of governments to issue its own currency is curtailed only by inflation and ideology. Adrian Buller, a degrowth scholar, discussed the response to COVID-19. For governments with substantial monetary sovereignty, there was no shortage of money to finance the things they needed. A wonderful paper released in 2023 dismisses learned helplessness outright. The paper draws heavily on the MMT arguments to show that states with sufficient monetary sovereignty face no obstacle to funding the policies necessary for a just and sustainable degrowth transition. Now, in summary, the majority of the climate movement adheres to a mainstream economic approach. Though it's influenced by Marxist thinkers who promote a heterodox perspective, academics loosely grouped as post-growth or degrowth already use the MMT lens to address the state's response to the climate crisis. Now, after assessing the general position in economic thinking within the climate movement, I considered the concept of learned helplessness. Economist Stephanie Kelton uses this phrase to describe the self-imposed ideological constraints that governments with high monetary sovereignty, those that issue and tax in their own currency, have minimum foreign currency debt and operate a floating exchange rate, place on their spending. Now, having the money to tackle the problem is often referred to as fiscal space. Modern monetary theory discusses fiscal space not in monetary terms, but in functional terms. The question is not where to find the money, but whether the government has available real resources that can be brought back into productive use. This is the core insight of MMT, and it highlights that fiscal space is much larger than mainstream economists, policymakers, commentators, and the public believe. And after conducting this literature review, it became clear that the climate movement was no different. Throughout the literature review, I found multiple examples of learned helplessness. That's assuming that governments do not have the fiscal space to respond to the public purpose. It's useful to examine some of those instances. Now, Professor Michael Jacobs at the Beyond Growth conference states that we must raise tax revenues to pay for state pensions and social security. A paper by Sandbrook et al. In 2022 states that economic arguments for large-scale public investment in green technologies will face competition from other pressing claims from direct social investment. That, of course, is true, but only because of government's choices framed by conventional wisdom, not by economic necessity. Now, this is the crux of learned helplessness, the belief that government finances is limited and that responding to the climate crisis must compete with other demands for public money. Within the literature, there was no distinction between monetary sovereign and non-monetary sovereign governments, another telltale sign of learned helplessness. There is a lack of understanding of the different roles that currency issuance, debt and borrowing play at different levels of government. Revenue from state and national carbon taxes is considered in the literature to have the same function, that is, to provide much needed finance. However, a state such as British Columbia, which has had a carbon tax since 2008, is a currency user, and state tax revenue increases the state's revenue. However, at the federal level, Canada does not require taxation to fund expenditure. Now, ActionAid and Stamp Out Poverty, both in 2024, argue that wealthier nations should fund poorer nations that do not have the same privilege to create currency. However, they still seek funding through taxation rather than an extension of fiscal space via public money creation, and rarely do they discuss the realities of a lack of technological transfer and their ownership of resources. Also, I found there's no distinction between private and public debt, and an assumption that government debt is bad. If you make the false assumption that government debt must be paid back in the future, you can argue you can have a moral obligation not to spend. Now, Jeffrey Sachs, the director of the Centre for Sustainable Development at Columbia University, discusses US government debt and warns younger members of the climate movement that you're going to be servicing the debt. This was on the Climate Pod in 2021. I think this debt is going to be a bigger burden in the future, and we ought to keep it under control, added Sachs. In discussing government finances, Lonergan and Sowers in 2021 tie themselves in knots, stating that borrowing to invest creates wealth, and borrowing to fund current spending leaves us with more debt. Now, MMT economists would refute this statement, stating that all government spending not taxed back creates financial wealth. They may also point out that the government is not borrowing as we commonly understand it, but rather facilitating the swap of private sector assets. Dr. Guinevere Gwenther on the Climate Pod in 2024 suggests that public money spent today will save the government money in the long term. Quoting Modern Money Ideas, Dr. Gwenther indicates that government spending will not fuel inflation. However, we're never far away looking for the payoff to fund a response to the climate crisis. There are ways to pay for this. We could raise taxes on the 1%, she says. Now, finally, learned helplessness is evident in the level of interest that government pays on its own debt. A comment from the Climate Pod in 2021 said deficit is fine if interest remains low. Lonergan and Sowers, again in 2021, based much of their book Supercharge Me on the window of opportunity that opened for the global north during the long period of low to zero interest rates. They maintain that while rates are low, government should borrow to fund investment, and when rates rise, that window of opportunity has passed. They never mention that interest rates are a policy choice and that governments can set them at zero or any level they choose. And most interesting to me, they never mention MMT, which has as its core policy the idea that the interest rate should be set at zero. Now, this would surely be a huge boon for states under their framework. The most common element of learned helplessness is treating government spending in monetary sovereign governments as tied to tax collection. This is almost ubiquitous across the climate movement, except among MMT economists in this space and a few degrowth and post-growth academics. And at the international level, the climate damages tax proposed by Stamp Out Poverty in 2024 suggests using taxation to fund the transition from the global north to the global south. Maria João Rodrigues, the former Minister of the Portuguese Republic and Professor of Economics, clearly stated that any EU climate action must be financed through taxes. Now, at a national level, the British Ecological Society in 2021 suggests that the revenue generated from fiscal instruments like taxes can be channeled into maintaining, managing and restoring nature-based solutions. Now, discussing state support for US floods, climate scientist Naomi Orskes at the University of Illinois in 2023 suggested that taxpayers will be stuck with the bill, suggesting a clear link between federal level government spending and taxation. That Sandbrook paper in 2022 again highlighted tax revenue as a source for conservation in the UK. Professor Milena Bucks states that we must tax wealth to fund the welfare state. Lonergan and Soares also refer to tax as a source of revenue for a monetary sovereign government. Our broad sample of sources within the climate movement shows overwhelming support for mainstream economic thought, including the view that monetary authorities are financially constrained. But what if access to finance isn't the main constraint for global north nations, and the global south is much less financially constrained? This knowledge gained through the MMT lens empowers the climate movement to demand faster, more substantial government action worldwide. An extension of fiscal space would enable public works, a Green New Deal, a job guarantee and support for a care economy. It would also enable a very different approach to climate finance, which is generally governed by a neoliberal framework that prioritises the private sector. The government does not need to incentivise international capital to finance green infrastructure. It can command those resources with public money. Now, the climate crisis is rooted in an extraordinarily complex system. The dominance of mainstream economic thought limits the scope of climate action. The adherence to conventional views obscures critical questions such as the source of the funds mobilised for the COVID-19 response and why similar financial resources are not directed towards the climate emergency. Adopting a modern monetary theory perspective could illuminate these issues, offering a robust framework to challenge existing constraints and inspire more ambitious climate action. So in summary, the climate movement relies on a mainstream economic understanding. It has the wrong economic bedfellow for solving our ecological problems. In 2000, Professor John McNeill wrote, "Neoclassical economic thought did not adjust to the economic conditions it helped create. Thereby, it continued to legitimate and indeed indirectly to cause massive and ecological change." As part of the broader heterodox schools of economics, MMT can offer an exceptionally useful lens to those within the climate movement. As Tim Jackson wrote in 2007, "We are in the eye of a storm of a relentless surge of materialism and from the economic models that perpetuate it." MMT insights can help break that economic paradigm. The climate movement finds a natural economic ally in MMT.